Before war clanged upon the field, it settled first upon bodies and stones. Armor was a house worn on the skin. Walls were armor worn by a land. Between these two, man sheathed and the place encircled, lay the art of not dying, the quiet craft of resisting ruin. Knights learned to carry their defenses with them. Masons taught towns how to make defenses stand when men fell. And always, beneath metal and mortar, there was cloth and timber, leather and rope, humble things that bore the brunt long before glory arrived. A man's first armor was what iron but linen. The gambeson, a quilted coat stitched of many layers, hugged the body tied snug beneath arm and throat. It smelled of sweat and tallow and the soap that never quite drove them out. It creaked faintly where stitches strained. It warmed in winter and baked in summer. Yet it did more than soften a blow. It spread force, took edges, protected skin from iron's ill temper. To put on a gambeson was to remember that softness to stand between hardness and harm. Over it flowed mail, a river of rings. Link by link, thousands upon thousands, a craftsman with sore eyes and steady wrists had riveted them into a fabric that draped like cloth and weighed like honesty. Mail drank oil and whispered when lifted. It pooled around the hips like a sigh and hugged the shoulders as if it meant to be a friend. It did not despise the thrust, but it preferred the cut. It turned blades to bruises and reminded the man within that every protection demands attacks of fatigue. When the day's work was over, mail came off with a grunted blessing, and hands smelled of iron until morning. Helms evolved as men learned where death likes to knock. First a simple iron cap, then a nasal bar to fend the blade that seeks the nose, then the great helm, a barrel for the head with eyes set in narrow, suspicious slits. It made men look like walking shrines, square, solemn, formidable, and it rang when struck with a dull music that only the wearer heard too loudly. Later the helm grew a face, the bassinet with its pointed crown and the visor that could be raised for air and lowered for argument. An aventail of mail fell from its brow like a veil of iron. Underneath was a padded cap, and under that the skull itself, and under that the thoughts that ought to be kept clear. Armor remembered that a man is more than his bone. It guarded the place where prayer lives. Plate arrived like a new grammar-shaped pieces tailored by hammer and heat to shins and thighs, to forearm and upper arm, to chest and shoulder. The cuirass cupped the ribs and sternum. Pauldrons grew wings to turn edges aside from the neck. Vambraces and gauntlets articulated like crab and beetle, a mechanical miracle that let fingers grip and wrists flex. At knees, polens bloomed with wings that guarded joint and tendon. At elbows, coudes flared, a petal of defense in a garden of threat. The armor-smith measured a man not only in inches but in habits. How he leaned, how he favored one leg, where his shoulder rounded from long bows or long hammers. Iron, persuaded, took those measures and learned to move like a second body. Beneath each plate were points laces that tied leather to eyelets, twined through with a squire's care, until nothing shifted but what should. An arming doublet fitted close, pierced at the right places. There was a joy in aligning whole to whole and finding the knot's memory from yesterday. Armor was not thrown on, it was worn like a vow. Two men dressed one. The rhythm of it became prayerful. Lift, settle, tie, test, nod. The last piece was the glove. When fingers slid into their iron shells and leather-kissed palm, the world narrowed to grip and sight, to breath and oath. Not all who traveled the road to danger could afford Iron's entire wardrobe. Many a footman went in gambeson alone, or with a sleeveless jack studded with small plates sewn underneath a poor man's plate, called brigandine. Others tied splints, long iron laths, along calf or forearm beneath leather. A hammered kettle hat shaded the face and turned blows like a roof turns rain. A simple heater shield bore a painted cross or simple color where nobler men boasted beasts. Chipped, smoke-stained, the board still stood between heart and harm. In such gear, men learned that defense is often patchwork and good enough. Armor needed more than oil. It needed wisdom. A shield lifted too late tires faster than a shield lifted early. A visor closed too soon steals breath that a man will want. Mail hung too long at the hem grabs a knee in mud and teaches humility without mercy. The trained learned how to rest while ready, how to find ease in bearing, how to let the weight sit on bone and not on muscle. A man in harness learns honesty about where he begins and ends. He knows his own width at doorways, his own height under beams, his own stamina under sun. Iron measures truth in sweat. If armor was a moving house, walls were a settled suit. Fortresses began in earth. The quickest defense a frightened valley can make is a bank throw up soil, pile it high, cut a ditch before it, set a palisade on top, sharp stakes interlaced and bound. A ringwork or motto rose like an artificial hill with a wooden tower on its crown. Such work went up in a season if hands were many and fear generous. It served against raider and quarrelsome neighbor, and it gave peasants a place to run when hooves shook the road. Wood burns, yes, but it also builds faster than stone, and sometimes speed is the true shield. Stone came where memory learned that enemies return. Curtain walls traced the hills back like a sleeping dragon. Towers stood at intervals to see farther and shoot wider. A keep rose in the center, a house of last resort where bread and hope were stored tight as secrets. The gatehouse became a mouth with teeth. Portcullis of iron or oak shod with iron, murder holes in the ceiling, arrow loops in flanking walls. Over the walkway, carpenters hung hoardings, timber galleries that let defenders rain arrows and stones straight down. Where timber feared flame, masons raised matriculations, stone jaws that bit empty air and fed enemies with falling rock. A wall is more than height. It is thickness, angle, footing, and the way it talks to the land. Good masons bend stone to hill and stream. They find rock that remembers pressure without sulking. They face outer courses smooth to shrug ladders and inner courses rough, so lime clutches well. They build buttresses where weight runs anxious, batter the base outward so rams glance off, lay string courses that force a sapper's tunnel to stumble. The craft is patient. A tower plumb to the eye can be wicked to a ram simply by having its heart set at a trick angle. Stone answers in centuries what wood answers in months. Around the base, a moat made arguments that armor could not. Where water could be borrowed from river or mill stream, it gleamed and stank by season's frog song and reed rustle in summer, black ice in winter, a herbal smell of rot that bred mosquitoes and discouraged close inspection. Where water refused, a dry ditch did the work, with honest depth and treacherous sides. Stakes or hidden pits made the descent foolish and the climb worse. Bridges of timber drew up or swung aside. A man of the far bank learned patience abruptly when the plank retreated like a sentence recalled mid-speech. Gate discipline was the daily liturgy of defense. Dawn opened, dusk closed. Strangers were asked their business and the name of someone who could vouch. Carts were searched with poles that prodded hay where thieves and worse crouch. Pigs squealed whenever sticks found them, and so did hidden men. The warden kept a book in his head, which face came daily, which rarely. Who owed coin, who drank too much, who looked over his shoulder at the wrong moment. A good gatekeeper saved more lives than a dozen heroes. He kept danger from needing iron's opinion. Towns learned to be fortresses that traded in peace. Stone walls traced their growth like tree rings. The burghers' wealth paid masons and mortar. Watchtowers rose at corners like thickened punctuation. Barbicans thrust outward from gates like clenched fists. Within, streets bent in doglegs that confounded a charge and made ambush easier for friends than for foes. Gates did not face each other, lest a ram could stare through one to the next. Wells were covered, granaries guarded, bastions placed where they could look across each other's shoulders. A town that has been burned learns to love geometry. Villages lacked stone but not sense. When rumor reached them, men cut thorn and stacked brush walls around the green. Carts were heaped to make wagenbergs, wheels locked and axles braced, a ring of stubborn wood with spear points bristling between spokes. The church, thick-walled, small-windowed, served as last shelter. Bells rang, not for mass alone, but for gathering. Women hauled stones to upper windows, children fetched water, old men sat with bows and remembered how to breathe between shots. Defense is a communal verb, even fear can be marshaled. Monasteries, set apart for prayer, learned caution from thieves who loved quiet cloisters more than loud markets. They raised walls, not to keep God in, but to keep wolves out, four-legged, two-legged, and the kind that carry torches. Gates were small. Guest halls stood near them so hospitality could be honest and prudent at once. Granaries were stout. Libraries often had doors heavier than the treasure room, for a book is harder to replace than gold. In towers, a monk kept not only lamps, but also a beacon laid ready for high wind, a basket of pitch or a stack of faggots, part of a chain of signal fires that ran along the spine of hills. Beacons stitched land to land. One flare on a western ridge became two on the next, then 4, then 20, a red sentence racing where hooves cannot. Shepherds watched by day for the laid wood. By night the glow meant gather, hide, pray, or run. A child who had seen a beacon knew what a nation feels like for the first time. Not a king's court or a bishop's map, but a string of hills that to speak to each other in flame. Inside a siege, defense changed from stones to stomachs. The rationer counted loaves and issues of grain, kept barley for beasts and wheat for men, cut cheese thinner than pride liked. The well became a saint. Every bucket was a pilgrimage. Wood for cook fires shrank to embers for soup, then to twigs for broth of hope. Men slept by the wall in shifts. Women took turns at ovens left cold more hours than they burned. Children learned not to cry at night, because sound travels upward to engines as surely as stones travel downward from them. On the ramparts, craft met craft. Arrow loops narrowed inside to give shooters a fan of sight. Crossbowmen leaned elbows on oak and let quarrels carry the argument. Stones lay in neat piles behind crenels. The best throwers were strong women with a knack for timing. Boiling water was kinder than oil. A poor house cannot spare oil for hatred. Heated sand poured through gaps, slid into visor slit and glove cuff alike, burning where water does not reach. A log, swung on chains, knocked ladders free so men fell like beads broken off a string. When flames licked hoardings, men with wet cloths and hook poles fought the fire like a living thief. Defenders sallied when pride and prudence agreed. A postern opened like an eye. A handful of men rushed out in a short, savage dash to burn a tower, cut a rope, seize a banner, drag back a prisoner whose tongue could be mined for plans, then back, quick as a swallow to Eve, door slammed, bar dropped, breathing hard with the dangerous joy of having been briefly larger than walls. Such darts of courage feed a garrison for a week. In the counting houses of lords, defense had another face, levies and tallage to pay for mortar and men, corvée days when peasants repaired ditches, shored banks, lugged stone, watch rotations posted on doors, names chalked under nights that must be walked. Defense is not only drama, it is schedule and sore backs. A wise lord bore some part himself, went atop walls, spoke to masons by name, bought good lime, paid on tie, because a wall built grudgingly falls early. On the road, defense was not height, but formation. Men with shields overlapped into a moving wall. Pikes stood like a winter field bristling with stubble too stiff for hooves. Archers hid behind stakes slanted like a bristling boar. Horsemen guarded wings or waited to punish pride that broke itself on spear thicket. When the chevauchee, scorched ride, came through, burning barns and trampling grain, villagers practiced the only defense that stands against fire. Remove what can be carried, hide what cannot, and live to plant again. Roads themselves made armor when watched well. Bridges with gatehouses choked a march to a trickle. Fords with rocks set cunningly forced, horse to pick a way with head bent and pride briefly humbled. Defiles narrow places where hill presses river, became mills where impatience is ground into losses. A small redoubt of timber at a bend in the lane, a ditch dug across a likely field, a wall of carts backed tight, a hedge laid thick with thorns. These were lesser plates that turned aside greater blows. It is easy to admire the bright of armor and the clean line of a wall. It is harder to love their costs. A village that sends men to move stone cannot bring hay in as swiftly. A household that buys a helm leaves a debt that gnaws through winter. The tax for walls is paid in loaves that are not baked and shoes that are not mended. Yet fear counts too, and surviving has its math. People learn to balance one more day on the ditch, one less at the plow, one more penny to the mason, one less to the tavern. Peace is dearer than ale. When siege ends by storm, negotiation, famine, or simply the boredom that dissolves armies' work of defense, scabs over, stones reset, new wood replaces blackened, lime dries pale as bone, then weathers to gentler shades. The wall remembers but does not speak. Armor is mended, dents are hammered into stories. Broken rings are replaced by a squire who now knows exactly how much patience weighs. A woman washes a gambeson with fuller's earth until stains become ghosts. A boy too young to have stood yet counts arrowheads and dreams bigger than his shoes. In quieter years, walls become walks for lovers. Towers hold doves as readily as lookouts. The keep's cold storerooms smell again of apple and smoked meat instead of fear. Children play at siege with sticks and songs, and their laughter runs bright along parapets meant to hear groans. Armor is brought out for processions and hung with garlands. Dents that once meant death to someone are touched lightly by curious hands. Defense, resting, becomes ornament. It is a mercy when such rest is long. Yet the craft remains, like a psalm remembered even by those who have not sung it lately. Smiths keep the rivet tools oiled. Masons send boys to fetch good sand from the bend in the river where grains pack tight. Wardens update their lists. The beacon wood is turned so it does not rot. Hinges are greased on gates that may never need to shut in anger again. This is it dread. It is discipline. The world is a house that we hope will stand. One keeps the roof mended even when the sky is blue. Armor and defenses are not emblems of fear alone. They are the courtesy that strength pays to life acknowledgement, that breath is worth guarding, that bread is worth sheltering, that children are worth the thickness of stone and the tiredness of shoulders. A man in harness does not despise the body within. he honors it with care. A town behind walls does not scorn the fields without. It learns to love them more tenderly for being defended. And so when evening came to the castle or the town, and the gate was barred with a bar that had seen many hands, and the watch took their lanterns and walked their circles, and a knight set his helm upon a peg whose dent matched the dent in his memory, defense exhaled. The stars looked kindly on stones and iron both. Within, bread was broken; without, foxes skirted moats and found other paths. The beacon slept. Night washed over walls and mail like water over rock. And in the morning the sun showed mortar lines and ringed links, and knew them for what they were, patient answers to a world that sometimes shouts. A castle at peace is a house with deep pockets and high views. A castle in siege is a chest whose lid is pressed by many hands, whose contents rattle, whose hinges complain. When banners appeared on the far ridge, and dust stood in pillars above the road, when scouts came back with faces tight and tongues brief, the lord and steward did not argue about what it meant. The bell was rung, the outer fields were called empty, flocks drove in, the last carts creaked under sacks that smelled of grain and fear. The gate closed not with ceremony but with haste. The bar dropped like a sentence finished too soon. Inside, the world reshaped itself in an afternoon. The yard that yesterday hosted games became an armory floor. The bakehouse counted loaves as soldiers rather than as suppers. The wellhead grew a rope-worn lip within a day. The steward paced with a tally in his palm. So many mouths, so many days' oats, so much salted meat, so much cheese, how many candles, how much oil, how much patience. The chaplain set lights before the Virgin and sorted the litany for storm and famine. Women hauled, children fetched, old men who had set stones when the curtain wall was young came and put their hands on her, as if greeting an aged friend called back into duty. Without, the besiegers made their own village tents sprouted in rings, fires kindled in ordered rows, pickets driven. The engines arrived like ungainly pilgrims, their ribs showing, their arms limp, to be assembled by men who swore affectionately and hit timbers as if they could persuade them to remember last year's victories. Carts dumped stones until the field looked sown with white fruit. The first measuring was done, paces taken, angles judged. The place where the wall bowed a little noted. The place where a tower sat on a seam of softer soil, marked with a smile. War is carpentry before it is courage. The first day's missiles were more message than murder. Stones studded and skittered, a few roof tiles leapt like startled birds. A beam in a stable complained and would later be thanked for not breaking. Arrows came up in testing arcs. A quarrel smacked into a shutter and stayed there quivering like an accusation. The castle answered with shots of its own, bolts that hummed with anger, arrows that arced with grace, stones that tumbled end over end to scatter fascinated men who had come too close to watch. Both sides learned each other's breath. The garrison spread along the wall by habit, not panic. A captain marked each crenel with a name. The keen-eyed were given loops with widest vista. The steady were set where ladders might come. The hot-blooded were posted near the postern for sudden errands. A woman with strong arms and a temper like good yeast took charge of the stone piles, rationing them like bread. Boys ran messages the way swallows stitch air, fear made quick by usefulness. Below, the kitchens measured wood, and the rationer dealt out flour in handfuls that hurt to look at. The well was guarded as if it were the Lord's heir. At dusk of the second day, rams came forward behind mantlets. Big ox-hide shields hung on wheels that whined. The ram's head wore iron, a boar with more stubbornness than beauty. It began to speak to the gate with a hollow thud that ran through wood into bone. Above, men with hook poles leaned out and tried to bite the mantlets and pull them aside. Others dropped rocks that sounded like punctuation marks upon the roof of hides. A pot poured sand heated to anger. The men beneath the hides shifted and cursed and kept rhythm. A ram is a drum. The castle learned its beat. Sappers began to scratch at a tower's foot where the mason's seams were older and perhaps less devout. They built a shed of planks and rawhide to crouch under. Smoke from their cooking fires had a guilty smell. Inside, pick met mortar, pick met stone, pick learned patience. They shored the eating out with timbers dry and eager. The defenders, wise to such hunger, put their ears to the floor of the gallery and listened. There is a song to men burrowing, travels in stone better than words. A counter-tunnel began, dug by men who did not fear the dark if it meant light for their children. Pits met pits, curses met curses. Short blades met in a ground that felt like a grave the two had agreed to share. Days took on a weather of their own. Dawn was arrows, noon was stones, evening was fire. At night both sides sang to keep courage awake and to pretend to the other that sleep was not desired. Inside, 2 loaves were baked for every 3 that wanted one. Meat grew stringy with repetition and stories of its former self. A child asked why the cheese was thinner. A woman told him the Virgin had asked for a longer prayer between bites. Thirst taught economy. Men learned to drink in swallows, to swill the mouth before the throat, to bless water as if it were wine. A messenger was let slip one night, clambering like a spider down the scarp, where ivy made a ladder that stung. He carried letters sewn inside his cap, written in a hand that shook but did not blot, promising endurance, asking for succor, naming dates and dwindling sacks. He wore no iron, speed was his harness. He reached the ditch, crossed it where carts had muddied a ford, slid through a hedge with thorns that told him truths about patience, and ran like a hare toward a town that might listen. Inside, the garrison prayed for his feet as if they were relics. Parley came on the 4th morning, because thirst of blood has its courtesies. A herald in a coat with checks like a chessboard walked to the ditch and asked for words. The Lord and the chaplain stood over the gate in their best patience. Terms were read, surrender with honors, safe conduct to leave with personal goods, or else no quarter when the ladder reached the parapet. The lord asked for tide to write to his liege. The herald was polite and said his master could read urgency without letters. Eyes were cool, voices steady. Everyone watched the wind, which is always the truest judge. Refusal stiffened everything. The engines spoke in earnest now. Their stones came not singly but like flocks, their shadows chasing each other over roofs and yards. The hoardings shook, then sagged, then fed the fire as the attacker's bolts found tar with the ease of a sin-finding habit. Men with wet hides and hooks fought flame as if it were a rogue cousin, knowing its tricks and shouting at it in the old family tongue. A beam fell and made a punctuation mark too large for grammar. Dust rose like a sudden fog, tasted of lime and mouse nests. In the chapel, the chaplain's voice did not rise. He read as if the psalm were a road and he must simply keep walking. A sally was decided, because standing only is a way of dying. Before dawn, when the camp's fires were sighing, and men are most like children again, the postern opened and a handful went out, picked for speed, for quiet, for liking each other in a way that makes men quick. They ran not at the tents, but at the nearest engine, that proud trebuchet nicknamed by its keepers as if it were a beloved mule. Torches licked its ropes, axes kissed its legs. A man with a knife like good news cut the sling. Shouts rose as from a bed where a bad dream has turned true. They fled then, as quickly, with 2 wounded carried like debts you intend to pay. Behind them the engine stood oddly, like a crane whose fish had decided to argue. Both sides cheered in the same breath for different reasons. Siege teaches people their parts. The mason became soldier with mallet. The miller counted sacks like a bishop counts souls. The laundress learned to bind wounds tighter than tears. The Lord fetched stones himself when pride could not lift them fast enough. The cellarer guarded a last cask as if it were a saint who disliked a crowd. A boy grew into his feet in a week. A girl learned where to aim a pot so it falls where ladder meets wall. The old told stories between flights of arrows about sieges they had heard of when they were young, and in the telling kept breath even and hands steady. Sickness entered as it does when strangers crowd and water is precious. A cough took a row of beds, a fever made eyes glassy, a sourness of the bowels taught humility. The herbal woman worked in a corner with mint, rue, and hope. The chaplain carried the oil that comforts dying. The steward allocated clean straw as if it were coin. The garrison learned to blaspheme less and wash more where water allowed. Death made a small procession at dusk when arrows were quietest. The dead were lowered from the wall on ropes to a dry ditch within, covered with earth that had earlier been an old garden. Promises were made to do better by them when God allowed. One noon the sapper's fire took, and a corner of a tower settled into itself with a groan that men felt in their teeth. The wall opened not in a grand arch, but in a jagged mouth. Horns blew, drums hurried men, ladders moved on shoulders, shields lifted, the air filled with rocks, wood, bolts, curses. The breach was the world for the span of a life. Men met their elbows and eyes heavy with iron and as light as birds with fear. Blades worked where there was no room to swing. Knees became weapons. Teeth had their own brief war. A red wet grew underfoot that made everything either slippery or sticky, and both are enemies to poise. The defenders had kept 2 carts ready with stones, their wheels chalked. Now they went forward like stubborn oxes and tipped their bellies down the slope of the broken wall, a river of rubble that made a new rampart out of ruin. Behind it, shields nested, spears bristled over the ridge like the first wheat in spring. The chaplain stood there too, not with sword, but with water and words, and a look that said both would be given where needed. The attackers fell back a dozen paces and tried again, as men do. The second meeting was shorter. The third held until both sides decided that breath is more precious than pride before sunset. Night was bargaining tie. Fires sprang up in the besiegers' ring like a second constellation. Inside, every candle was spared unless it was needful for stitching or dyeing. The Lord convened his captains. The steward spread the grim table of numbers. They counted like misers and saints both. If help would come in 2 days, could bread last 3? If water must be drawn at half buckets, could the men on the south wall still sing? If a sally tomorrow ruined the ram, would the breach hold until marvels arrived? Calculation is the rope men cross chasms on when they cannot fly. Dread. Dawn brought a banner new to the ridge and a murmur that grows legs. The messenger had earned his bread. A relief force showed its colors like flowers the valley thought lost to frost. The besiegers turned part of their face that way, and the castle breathed an eighth of a lungful. Yet no gate swung wide, no fool rushed. The day became a plaited rope of skirmish and shot, of feint and answer. In the afternoon a storm came in like a bishop who will brook no nonsense, rain drummed tense to humility, soaked bowstrings, cooled stones, made the breach a slide of sincerity. Both sides thanked God for the pause and pretended to have planned it. When battles met beyond the ditch, the castle watched like a man at a window whose sons dispute in the yard. The field glittered with moving drops. Horses sprayed mud and light. Cries surged and broke standards tilted like wind-bent trees and righted with an obstinacy that made old men nod. Inside, women stood on stools to see over parapets, then turned away to stir pots and to bind a boy's scraped hand, because glory is a good cloak but a poor bandage. At evening the relief held the ridge, the besiegers held the ditch, and the castle held its breath again until night made everyone honest. Some sieges end with bravery, many end with bargain. At last the herald came once more, and the Lord listened with eyes that had measured his well against the sky. Terms were kinder now that help gleamed on the horizon. The garrison would march out with arms and honor. The poor would remain. The church would not be burned. The granary would be inventoried under 2 seals. The Lord would be exchanged like a promise for one of equal weight in another hall. The chaplain watched both faces and nodded once. Pride is a good horse. It must be reined before it throws the rider. The gate opened at noon the next day, because noon is a tide that insults neither side. Men filed out 2 by 2, helmets bright where they had been rubbed, dents worn like medals, hunger disguised by posture. Women followed with bundles. Children stumbled, holding bread that had been saved for this very walk. The besiegers stood aside, curious and silent. They saw their own faces on these others, smeared with the same mud, drawn by the same knights. A drum rolled softly, as if not to wake those who had stayed behind forever. Afterwards, the castle had to learn the art of breath again. Ashes were swept, beams propped. A mason climbed with line and weight and said where to put the first stone of healing. The well rope was replaced. The bakehouse smelled of bread without the taste of fear. The chapel's candles burned as prayer rather than as policy. Names were said, with tears and with relief both. A child counted the fallen arrows as if they were shells by a summer sea. A woman washed a gambeson until the water turned the color of old stories. The steward slept, and for a night did not count. Years later, when peace sat in the yard like an old dog content to be scratched, someone would point to a patched seam in the wall and tell the tale of the day stone flowed like water and courage like wine. The breach would be a bench for lovers. The postern would be a place where boys dared each other to stand. After dark, the well would be complimented like an aunt who had lent more than she could bear. But the memory would keep its teeth. When clouds built strange on the far ridge, when horsemen on the road looked too many for market, when a raven sat too long on the gatehouse cross, hands would know where to go without being told. A castle in siege is a society learning itself at speed. What it will share, what it will spare, where it will bend, where it will break. Stones teach patience, iron teaches honesty, hunger teaches mercy, songs teach stubbornness, prayer teaches all of these to sit at table together. In the end, whether the gate holds or yields, the true walls are the habits that kept fear at heel for one more hour. And when night fell on the last day and the lanterns walked the parapets in their slow constellations, the castle lifted its face to the same stars as the camp beyond. Both asked for sleep. Both for a while received it. An army on the move was more than knights in glittering harness. It was a walking town, a restless city that carried its own market, its own court, its own refuse, its own prayers. Where it halted, fields became streets, hedgerows became boundaries, fires made neighborhoods, and the air thickened with smoke, sweat, horse breath, and anticipation. To muster was to summon not only warriors, but the whole scaffolding of life that clung to them, as Ive clings to stone. The gathering began with summons, proclamations read on market days, sealed letters borne by messengers, a lord's voice echoing in a hall. Men came in small knots from hamlet and manor, bearing what arms they had. A spear polished at its point by honest hay before, now bound with new iron. A shield painted quickly with lime and lampblack, a leather cap hammered straight after being bent in some childhood accident. They brought bundles of bread, skins of ale, knives meant for both camp and fight. Some led oxes or horses. Some brought carts with squealing wheels. Some carried everything on backs not yet grown used to such weight. The muster yard became a catalogue of a region's strength and poverty both. At the mustering ground, names were called as in church, each man stepping forward to be seen, to nod, to swear, to take his place in the roll. Captains marked them with chalk or ink, sometimes with memory alone. A young man flushed when his name was missed, because in such a crowd omission felt like a theft of self. He demanded to be written, and the scribe obeyed with an arched brow. Men sorted themselves into hundreds and tens, into retinues that shared a lord, into bands that shared a dialect. Familiar faces grouped, strangers looked sideways, measuring future trust. Craftsmen came with them, for war eats more than courage. The smith carried his anvil head in a cart, swearing at its weight, but swearing worse when it was late. The fletcher bore a chest of half-made shafts, feathers bundled like geese in flight. The cook trundled pots blackened with older wars, more precious than silver because they turn grain and water into fuel. The armorer shouted for space to pitch his tent, for he knew before battle he would be asked to patch half the host. A few women walked with them, wives, laundresses, herb wives, faces set in lines that meant no one would move them now. When the army camped, it unfolded itself like cloth. Stakes went into ground with a rhythm older than speech. Ropes stretched, hides and linen flapped up into shelter. Knights raised colored tents, striped or checkered, their pennons fluttering like impatient hands. Common men leaned poles together and threw cloaks or wattled hurdles over them. Horses were staked, lines drawn between carts, fires struck with flint and tinder. Within an hour an empty field smelled of roasting, of leather, of dung, of smoke, of men settling into order. The camp street was a thing of improvisation and memory. Both paths worn between tents became lanes. The well or the stream became a square. A chapel tent with its cross stood at the center, and men touched caps when passing. Market wagons rolled up even here, selling trinkets, pies, ribbons, dice. Children darted among legs, fetching water for a copper, holding horses for a crumb. Minstrels tuned lutes or fiddles in corners, hoping to earn coin with songs that flattered one side and mocked the other. Every army carries its own economy, because hunger and boredom are as real as the enemy. Discipline was a fence built daily. A captain walked the rows at dusk, noting fires that burned too high, men who drank too deep, tents pitched too near the latrine trench. Punishments were swift, for an army cannot argue long with itself when danger sits just beyond. A man who stole bread found himself whipped. One who raised knife against a comrade found himself bound. One who left watch for sleep bore shame that clung heavier than chains. Yet within those bounds, laughter was loud, dice clattered, boasts were born and pricked, and friendship hardened like iron quenched in water. The soundscape of a camp was never still. Horses stamped, whinnied, blew through nostrils like bellows. Hammers struck anvils in a heartbeat rhythm that answered drums. Men shouted greetings, called names, swore at stakes and ropes. Over it all, the calls of watchmen marked the hours, each cry taken up by the next as a chant of vigilance. At night, the distant crack of an enemy's fire could be heard, and silence fell for a moment as each man measured the nearness of tomorrow. Then concert rose again, softer, as men huddled nearer their own flames. The Lord's pavilion stood proud at the camp's heart, taller, painted, sometimes gilded. Within, a table held maps, sheepskin stretched and inked with rivers, hills, names of towns, candles guttered in lanterns that smoked the canvas roof. Captains gathered, voices low, hands stabbing at lines, pebbles standing for companies, cups for cavalry. Outside, guards paced with spears, their faces fixed, but ears pricked. Decisions taken within the painted cloth rippled outward through the lanes of tents, until a plowman knew by dusk whether he would stand in the van or the rear come dawn. For the common soldier, the day was measured by drills and chores. Spears were hefted, shields overlapped, bows bent and loosed at straw sacks hung from poles. Men marched in files until their feet learned to ignore stones. They dug ditches to ring the camp, set palisades of sharpened stakes, learned the worth of a barrier that might buy them an hour in the dark. Work kept fear from growing teeth too quickly. Work also gave men stories to tell later of how they marched in mud to their ankles, yet laughed at a jest too coarse to repeat before wives. Night in the camp was a mingling of comfort and dread. Fires ringed the lines, their smoke rising like prayers. Pots bubbled with pottage made of grain and whatever meat the quartermaster had found, sometimes ox, sometimes rabbit, sometimes less welcome fare. Songs rose, ballads of home, drinking catches, prayers set to melody, boasts about girls not yet kissed and foes not yet met. Beyond the circle of flame, shadows stretched, and the watch walked with slow steps, their eyes never still. From the dark sometimes came sounds, a fox, a horse shifting, an enemy scout. The boundary between safety and peril was no wider than the glow of a coal. The camp followers were their own small nation. Laundresses boiled clothes until steam rose in ghostly pillars. Sutlers sold wine sourer than vinegar but sweeter than nothing. Whores plied trade, guarded by men who kept knives sharp. Jugglers and storytellers found coin where fear made men generous. Thieves moved too, though careful, for justice in camp could be swift and terminal. Children ran with dogs, learning a soldier's curses before a scholar's letters. War pulls behind it all the occupations of peace, drawn like thread through the needle of necessity. Morning roll call had its own majesty. Drums beat, horns blew, men spilled into lines, faces rough with sleep. Captains called names, Men raised hands, muttered here, or stayed silent when sickness had taken voice away. The banner unfurled in the early light, dew shaking from its edge. Prayer followed, led by chaplain or priest, Latin words mumbled into many dialects, ending with a cross traced over faces, still marked with ash from the fire. Then orders were read: march, dig, drill, rest. An army is a machine of hours. Its strength lies not only in arms, but in rhythm. Sometimes the enemy's camp was visible from a hill. Two cities glared at each other across a valley, two forests of tents, two rings of smoke, two murmuring crowds. At night, men swore they could hear the other side's songs. Sometimes insults were shouted back and forth, rude poems that turned names into jeers. Other times there was silence, which was worse, for it allowed imagination to fatten on dread. The two armies mirrored each other in fear and in hope, each man thinking the same thoughts beneath a different banner. Disease was an enemy more patient than any army. Lice bred in seams. Fevers ran from tent to tent. Wounds festered. Bellies cramped from bad water. The surgeon's tent grew busy, smelling of vinegar, honey, sweat, and herbs. Men whispered of plague, of pestilence that did not carry a sword but struck quicker. The camp learned to dig latrines far and deep, to boil water, to pray harder. Yet still men died in their beds with swords by their sides, victims not of valor but of filth. War and filth are poor neighbors, but neighbors they remain. Yet even amid fear there was festivity. Feast days were marked by mass, by candles, by loaves shared. Lords gave coins for ale, knowing cheer is cheaper than mutiny. Men danced, clapped hands, shouted choruses into the night until laughter drowned dread. A knight might tilt at quintain to show off for squires. A minstrel might spin a tale of Alexander or Roland to remind them that armies have triumphed before. Such moments did not erase fear. They put it in a chair and poured it a cup until it drank itself smaller. When at last the order came to march, camp folded itself as swiftly as it had sprung. Fires were stamped, ashes scattered, ropes unknotted, carts loaded. The field bore scars, blackened patches where hearths had burned, muddy lines where tents had stood, scraps of straw, bones, broken arrows. Birds descended as soon as men left, scavenging what hunger and haste forgot. The army moved like a beast, long and slow, banners nodding above it, drums and horns setting the pace. Behind, the ground remembered a brief town that had lived, laughed, wept, and gone, leaving only ruts and ashes. The muster and camp were but preludes only. They were battles of their own kind, against hunger, boredom, sickness, impatience. Victory here meant an army that still had the strength to fight when the field was reached. A broken camp was as fatal as a broken line in combat. Lords knew this. Sergeants knew this. Even the humblest peasant with a spear learned it. For war is won on the day of clash alone, but in the thousand small labors of tents, fires, names called, horses watered, and bread baked. And so, when night fell again on a camp that seemed to stretch from one horizon to the other, men lay down with the smell of smoke in their hair, the ache of labor in their limbs, the murmur of comrades in their ears. They slept under canvas patched a dozen times, under stars they had forgotten to notice at home, under the weight of both dread and anticipation. Tomorrow would bring orders, tomorrow might bring battle. Tonight was theirs in this fragile town of rope and cloth that lived for a heartbeat in the middle of a war. Episode 16: Medieval Medicine and Healing. Few words carried as much dread in the medieval world as plague. To hear it whispered was to feel one's heart sink. To see death's shadow fall across village or city before it arrived. When plague came, life itself seemed to falter. The Black Death of the 14th century became legend in its own time. It swept across lands with terrifying speed, carried by ships, rats, and fleas. But to those who lived through it, its causes were less clear. Some said foul air, some said poisoned wells, some said wrath of God. None doubted its power. It began with fever, then swellings rose in groin and armpit, black and swollen, painful to touch. Some bled from lungs, coughing red into cloths, others weakened within days. For many, death followed swiftly, too swift for remedies to matter. Cities suffered worst. Narrow alleys, crowded homes, and filth gave plague no obstacle. Bells tolled without ceasing, carts rolled through streets collecting bodies, graveyards filled until earth itself seemed to groan. Silence fell where once markets bustled, fear louder than cries of hawkers. Villages, too, were struck. Whole families died in days, cottages stood empty, fields left unplowed. Survivors whispered prayers over abandoned hearths, too few hands to bury dead. Some villages never recovered, fading from maps like smoke blown away. Priests led processions through streets. Candles burned, relics raised, litanies sung to heaven. Feet trudged through dust, voices cracked with fear. People knelt, begging mercy, confessing sins aloud. Faith became louder, more desperate in face of death's advance. But fear twisted faith too. Some turned against neighbors, accusing them of sin or sorcery. Rumors spread of wells poisoned, strangers cursed. Hatred and panic joined plague as companions, cruelty feeding on fear. Doctors offered little. They carried posies of herbs, wore long-beaked masks, stuffed with spices, prescribed bloodletting or vinegar. Some burned fires in streets to cleanse air, others urged fleeing to countryside. Few cures worked, yet each was tried with hope. Children learned terror too soon. They saw parents weaken, neighbors vanish, carts of bodies pass. Songs once playful turned grim, ring-a-ring o' roses, a pocket full of posies. Fragments of nursery rhymes carried memory of sorrow. Some fled to wilderness, leaving city behind. They slept in barns, in fields, in forests, hoping to escape poisoned air. Yet plague followed, unseen, striking wherever fear thought safe. Hospitals overflowed, monasteries filled with sick, monks and nuns tended without rest, many dying in service. Their courage was praised, their losses mourned, their names remembered as martyrs of mercy. Graveyards expanded swiftly, pits dug wide, bodies laid in rows, earth thrown hastily. Priests muttered prayers over heaps of dead, bells tolling endlessly. Survivors wept until voices failed, then wept again. Plague scarred memory of generations. Survivors carried grief in faces, silence in hearts. Some grew more devout, others turned bitter, convinced God had abandoned them. Faith and despair wrestled within each soul. Yet even in shadow, hope flickered. Some recovered miraculously strong, families rebuilt, villages repopulated, laughter returned though quieter. Life proved stubborn, refusing to yield fully to death. The Black Death was not only a 14th century plague returned in waves, decade after decade, century after century. Each outbreak reopened wounds, each toll of bell recalled old fear. Remedies multiplied. People wore charms, burned juniper, drank potions of vinegar and herbs, masks of herbs, fires in streets, pilgrimages to shrines. None proved certain, but all gave comfort. Art remembered plague in darker tones. Walls painted with danse macabre, skeletons leading kings, priests, and peasants alike in dance of death. Such images reminded all that death spared no rank, no wealth, no learning. Children grew up with these images. They learned that death was constant companion, that plague could come again. Their games, their songs, their fears carried echo of shadow. Plague reshaped society. With so many dead, fields lacked workers, wages rose, peasants found new strength. Power shifted subtly, society rebuilt itself upon bones of fallen. And yet, despite loss, life endured. Marriages celebrated, children born, markets reopened, bells rang once more for joy as well as sorrow. Humanity's resilience proved greater than plague's shadow. In memory, plague became both terror and teacher. It reminded medieval soul of frailty, of need for faith, of fleeting nature of life. It carved humility deep into hearts, but also gratitude for every day survived. Thus, plague's shadow never left medieval mind. It haunted songs, paintings, prayers, and tales. But in that shadow also shone light, courage of healers, endurance of families, mercy of faith. And so the plague became part of healing's story, not as cure, but as trial. It shaped medicine, faith, and memory, teaching that even in darkest fear, life and hope could endure. If plague reminded medieval people of death's nearness, childbirth reminded them of life's fragile beginning. It was moment of wonder and terror, of joy mingled with fear. For in those hours when child entered world, both mother and infant walked narrow road between life and loss. Midwives were guardians of this threshold. They were summoned at first pains, their footsteps hurried through night streets or across fields. At their arrival, households shifted, women gathered, men stepped aside, neighbors came to help. Midwife carried knowledge not in books, but in hands, in eyes, in memory of countless births witnessed. The birthing room was dim, warmed by fire, lit with candles. Herbs burned to cleanse air, prayers whispered to steady hearts. Cross hung above bed, holy water sprinkled at door. Fear and faith mingled in smoke and silence. The mother labored on stool or bed, supported by women's hands. Midwife murmured guidance, rubbed oils into skin, placed cloths warm with steam. Her voice calmed, or eyes watched closely. She was steady in storm of pain. Tools were few but precious. A birthing stool carved with handles, cloths boiled in water, herbs brewed for tea, oils for easing pain. Midwife's hands were truest tools, firm, gentle, ready to turn child, to catch life, to comfort mother. Hours stretched, cries filled room, prayers grew urgent. Women sang hymns, whispered charms. Saint Margaret guard her, Holy Mary guide her. Saints were called as if standing nearby, protectors unseen but present. At last the infant emerged, slippery, red, crying. Midwife lifted child, cut cord with knife, washed in warm water, wrapped in linen. A candle was lit, symbol of new life, flame fragile as breath. If child was weak, midwife acted swiftly. She rubbed chest with salt, whispered prayer, splashed holy water in emergency baptism. No child was left unblessed, for death could come within minutes. Faith demanded speed, mercy demanded action. Mother, too, was tended with care. Warm cloths soothed her, herbs eased bleeding, broth strengthened body. Yet many women weakened, some never rising from bed again. Death in childbirth was sorrow known to every village, every family. Midwives carried heavy burden. They brought life, but also bore witness to loss. They comforted grieving husbands, held motherless infants, prayed over still forms. Their hearts carried weight of both miracle and mourning. Yet their wisdom was honored. Communities trusted them, children blessed them, families repaid them with gifts of bread, wool, or coins. Their role was sacred as priests, though their altar was not stone but bedside. Superstition surrounded birth, knots untied in house to ease labor, iron placed under bed to ward off spirits, charms spoken to protect mother. Each act was safeguard, every tradition shield against unseen dangers. Some midwives kept secret knowledge. They knew herbs to ease pain, but also herbs to prevent conception, whispered only to trusted women. Such secrets made them both valued and feared. Childbirth shaped family deeply. A son was joy, a daughter a blessing, any infant miracle. Baptism followed swiftly, bells rang, godparents chosen. Yet fear lingered. Would child survive winter, fever, hunger? Every breath in cradle was gift. Women remembered midwife's presence all their lives, her hands steady in pain, her voice in darkness, her face first seen by newborn. She was woven into memory of family, her role never forgotten. Men, though absent from room, honored her too. They knew their wives' lives rested in her skill, their children's future in her care. Gratitude was silent but deep. Songs and prayers grew around childbirth. Some invoked Mary's own labor, some praised saints who guarded women, some whispered charms old as pagan days. These words carried comfort, linking each birth to larger story of faith and tradition. Communities shared in joy and grief. When birth succeeded, neighbors celebrated, gifts brought, feasts held. When death struck, bells tolled, silence fell, support given. Birth was never private, but woven into fabric of whole village. Midwives aged with wisdom. Wrinkles lined faces, hands grew stiff, but knowledge grew vast. Younger women came to learn, carrying tradition onward. Midwife's legacy lived not only in children she caught, but in women she trained. Thus, childbirth in medieval world was not only biological act, but sacred passage. It was surrounded by prayer, by tradition, by fear and faith together. It revealed fragility of life, but also resilience of women, strength of community, mercy of God. Every child born was miracle, every mother surviving warrior, every midwife keeper of wisdom as old as humanity. And so, in flicker of candles, in cries of labor, in whispered prayers, medieval birth revealed both peril and wonder, a threshold where life began, where love deepened, where hope renewed itself in sound of newborn's cry. In the medieval world, food was more than sustenance. It was remedy, prevention, and cure. Every meal was judged not only for taste or strength, but for its power to balance humors, to warm or cool, to dry or moisten. The line between kitchen and apothecary was thin, and diet was as important to healing as herbs or prayer. Physicians taught that body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each food influenced these humors. Bread from wheat was warm and moist, barley cooler and drier, wine heated, water cooled. Meat of lamb was gentle, beef heavy, pork rich and clogging. To eat was to choose medicine with every bite. Broths were staples of cure. A sick man might sip broth of leeks and onions, gentle on stomach, warming body. A woman weakened after childbirth might drink broth thickened with oats or lentils, strengthening and moist. Broths were easy to digest, carriers of herbs, comfort as well as cure. Honey was treasured, sweet, golden, and healing. It was stirred into drinks for fevers, spread on wounds to cleanse, mixed with herbs to soothe throats. Bees were seen as holy creatures, their honey gift of nature and symbol of purity. Garlic was medicine as much as food. It was eaten against coughs, rubbed on chest for colds, hung at doors to ward sickness. Strong and pungent, it was believed to strengthen lungs and drive away bad air. Wine, too, was used in healing. It was mixed with herbs as tonic, poured on wounds to cleanse, sipped for strength. Red wine warmed the body, white cooled. Even when diluted, it was thought safer than foul water. Milk and dairy carried mixed views. Sweet milk of cow was nourishing but heavy, goat's milk lighter, sheep's richest. Butter soothed burns, cheese was thought clogging, cream indulgent. Each was judged for effect on humors. Spices were prized as medicines more than luxuries. Cinnamon warmed stomach, cloves eased toothache, nutmeg cheered heart, pepper cleared phlegm. Merchants sold them as remedies, apothecaries ground them into powders. To taste spice was to taste far-off cure. Vegetables were valued for cleansing. Leeks, onions, cabbage, and carrots filled stews. Nettles were gathered for spring blood cleansing. Dandelions for livers, fennel for eyes. Green plants were not only food of poor, but medicine of wise. Fruits carried humoral qualities. Apples cooled, pears moistened, cherries cheered, grapes strengthened blood. Dried figs and raisins restored energy. Prunes eased bowels. To eat fruit was both pleasure and prescription. Fasting was also healing. By abstaining from meat or rich foods, body was believed to rebalance itself. Lent became rite not only of devotion, but of cleansing, easing humors with fish, bread, and vegetables. Illness often changed diet. A fevered man was fed little but bread soaked in water or wine. A weak child given thin porridge sweetened with honey. An elder with failing teeth ate soft stews and broths. Food was adjusted to sickness, not sickness forced to endure food. Monks recorded diets in medical texts. They noted which foods strengthened, which harmed, which suited which season. Winter called for warming meals of meat and ale, summer for cooling dishes of fruit and fresh greens. Eating was matched to rhythm of year as well as body. Children learned early that food was medicine. Mothers told them to eat garlic for lungs, onions for strength, honey for health. Refusal met not only scolding but fear, for to reject food was to reject healing. Feasts, too, were measured by medicine. Rich foods eaten rarely, for too much roast meat or sweet spiced cake upset humors. Even nobles knew excess carried sickness, though they often ignored warnings in delight of table. Herbal drinks were daily remedies. Teas of chamomile for sleep, mint for stomach, sage for memory, rosemary for strength. Brewing pot of herbs was as common as baking loaf of bread. Household medicine always near at hand. Eggs were praised for nourishment, soft-boiled for sick, poached for weak, raw mixed with wine for vigor. Yolks warmed, whites cooled, balance even within shell. Fish fed body gently. River fish for poor, salted herring for fasting days, fresh salmon for feast. Fish was thought cooling, suited to hot humors, balancing rich meats of festivals. Food also healed spirit. A shared loaf cheered sorrow, a sweet cake brought joy, a warm drink comforted fear. Medicine was not only in humors but in heart, and taste of kindness often cured as much as herbs. In plague years, people carried posies of herbs, chewed cloves, drank vinegar. Food became shield, a way to resist unseen death. Few were saved, but many found courage in act of eating what was believed protective. In hunger years, food itself was medicine by rarity. A bowl of porridge, a crust of bread, a mug of ale, each bite life renewed, each sip body restored. Scarcity made clear that medicine's first form was nourishment. Thus, food in medieval world was never ordinary. It was measured, judged, prescribed, blessed. Each meal could heal or harm, each bite chosen with care. The kitchen was pharmacy, the hearth apothecary, the table hospital. Mothers, monks, and physicians alike agreed to eat wisely was to live longer, to eat foolishly was to fall sick. And so food as medicine bound body and spirit, hunger and healing, taste and cure. It filled bowls and hearts alike, reminding medieval soul that life's first doctor was bread itself. Every healer, whether monk, barber, surgeon, or wise woman, carried tools of craft. Their bag was treasure chest and arsenal, filled with items humble yet powerful. To open it was to glimpse the art of medieval medicine, half science, half ritual, wholly bound to hope. The bag itself was leather, worn smooth, heavy with use. Straps buckled tight, its seams carried scent of herbs and iron, smoke and beeswax. When healer entered cottage or market square, all eyes went to bag, for within lay chance of cure. Inside were knives, sharp and slender, some for lancing boils, some for cutting veins, some for trimming flesh around wound. Their edges gleamed, their handles worn by countless grips. Each carried fear as much as relief. Leeches wriggled in jars of water, dark and hungry. Healer lifted them with care, placing on swollen skin to draw blood. People shivered at sight, yet trusted their slow suction more than knife's quick cut. Cupping vessels lay ready, small glass or horn cups, heated by flame, pressed to skin to draw blood and humors. They left red circles, strange marks of cure. To see them lined on shelf was to know healer's trade by sight. Needles and thread waited for wounds, thick and crude by modern eyes, yet strong enough to hold flesh closed. Healer's hands moved swiftly, stitching skin like cloth, each knot prayer for survival. Salves and ointments filled jars, beeswax blended with herbs, oil steeped with flowers, powders mixed with wine. Some cooled burns, others eased pain, some fought festering. Their scents ranged from sweet lavender to sharp vinegar, each distinct. Powders were wrapped in parchment, ground roots, dried berries, minerals pounded fine, some swallowed in drink, others blown into wounds, others sprinkled on cloth. The bag rustled with crackle of these fragile packets. Bandages filled corners, linen strips torn from old cloth, boiled for cleanliness, rolled tight. Healer wrapped wounds layer by layer, binding flesh and spirit in care. Herbs dried and bundled lay within too. Sage, thyme, rosemary, chamomile, each labeled with memory, not ink. Healer knew which leaf eased fever, which soothed stomach, which chased melancholy. A mortar and pest often accompanied bag, heavy stone, worn smooth, ready to grind leaves into paste, seeds into powder. Its sound was music of healing, steady rhythm of preparation. Small vials of holy water, relic fragments, or blessed salt, sometimes nestled among tools. For healer knew faith worked alongside herb and blade. These sacred items comforted patients, strengthened trust, and soothed souls. Some healers carried astrological charts folded in leather case. They consulted stars before bleeding, checking moon's phase, planet's hour. To them no cut should be made without heaven's approval. Teeth pulling tools, crude iron forceps, lay ready for agony of rotten molars, their jaws clamped tight, their pull swift, leaving both pain and relief. Patience dreaded sight, yet came nonetheless. Burning irons for cautery gleamed blackened at ends. Heated red, pressed to wound, they sealed blood, killed rot, left scars. Their hiss was sound of both terror and survival. Dupplines, nestled in bags, small collections of remedies, lists of herbs, prayers for healing, pages stained with smoke and oil, their margins filled with notes. For even practical healers sought wisdom beyond memory. Children stared wide-eyed when healer opened bag. They whispered of wonders inside, feared leeches, marveled at knives. To them, bag was both magical and frightening, symbol of mysteries beyond ordinary life. Villagers recognized healer by clink and rattle of bag. Its sound meant aid had come, whether for fevered child, bleeding wound, or laboring mother. Its presence was hope, however rough its contents. Healers guarded bags carefully. Tools were costly, herbs precious, vials sacred. To lose bag was to lose livelihood, to lose power of healing. Each item carried stories. Knife that cut fevered vein, leech that drew sickness, salve that eased burn, relic that calmed spirit. Bag was not only filled with objects, but with memories of lives touched. Apprentices learned first by carrying bag. They fetched herbs, cleaned knives, boiled bandages, filled jars. Step by step, bag became theirs, inheritance of craft passed hand to hand. Even in death, healer's bag remained symbol, sometimes buried with them, sometimes kept by family, sometimes given to next healer. It marked life devoted to service, however flawed, however imperfect. Thus, the healer's bag embodied medieval medicine itself. It held blade and herb, prayer and charm, science and superstition. It carried fear and faith alike, bound together in leather strap. And so, when healer entered room, all eyes turned to bag. Its opening was moment of tension, for within lay both pain and promise. It was not miracle chest, but it was what they had, and it was enough to give hope. In the medieval world, the word hospital did not mean only a place of surgery or cure. It meant house of mercy, house of hospitality. A hospital sheltered sick, poor, orphan, widow, and pilgrim alike. It was roof for weary, bread for hungry, and prayer for dying. Healing of body and soul walked hand in hand within its walls. Many hospitals stood near churches or monasteries. Their halls stretched long, lined with rows of beds or pallets. Whitewashed walls reflected candlelight. Crucifix hung at head of hall, and altar stood where priest might celebrate mass for sick. The air smelled of herbs, wood smoke, and humanity. Steaming broths carried from kitchens, ointments prepared in side rooms, incense burned in chapel. Voices of prayer mingled with coughs and groans. Sick were admitted not by coin alone. Charity demanded that poor be cared for, even when pockets were empty. A beggar at gate, a pilgrim too weak to walk, a child with fever, all found place. Straw mattress, blanket, bowl of soup. Nuns often tended patients. Their veils rustled as they moved quietly from bed to bed, washing brows, changing bandages, spooning broth. Their work was devotion, service to Christ in guise of sick. To care for poor was to care for him. Brothers too served. Monks carried water, ground herbs, read psalms at bedsides. Lay servants fetched firewood, swept floors, washed sheets. All labor was part of mercy. No task too small when done for sick. Hospitals sheltered pilgrims on long roads. Weary travelers, their feet blistered, bodies thin, found rest. Beds filled with those on way to Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome. Pilgrim badges glittered faintly in firelight, proof of journeys walked for hope and healing. Some hospitals were grand, funded by kings or bishops. They had stone halls, tiled floors, painted chapels, fountains in courtyards. Others were humble, wooden, draughty, with only few beds, yet whether rich or poor, each stood as sign of charity. Children were often seen within, orphans found shelter, fed and clothed, taught prayers. Abandoned infants left at door were baptized, cared for, sometimes adopted. The hospital was parent when none else remained. At night, candles burned low. Nuns whispered prayers as patients slept fitfully. Some groaned, some wept, some slipped quietly into death. Bells tolled softly, marking passing of souls, reminding all that hospital cared, not only for life but also for end. Meals were simple but nourishing. Bread dipped in broth, ale watered down, pottage of peas or beans, sometimes fish. Meat was rare, given to those most weak. Yet even simple food was blessing to hungry. Medicine was given as best as could be. Salves rubbed on sauce, herbs brewed for fever, wounds washed in wine, bandages changed. Remedies varied, success uncertain, but care itself gave comfort. Prayer was constant, masses said for sick, relics carried through halls, blessings whispered at bedsides. Healing was sought as much from heaven as from earth. For many, cure was miracle, but mercy itself was gift enough. Hospitals also served dying priests anointed with holy oil, nuns held hands, candles lit. Death was faced not alone, but with prayers rising, with crucifix held close, with community present. Charity shaped hospitals deeply. Wealthy donors gave lands or coin, leaving legacy of care. Guilds sponsored wards for members. Kings founded houses for poor. To give to hospital was to give to God. Charity for salvation of soul. Walls often bore paintings of saints healing sick, Christ as Good Samaritan, Mary comforting sorrowful. Such images lifted eyes from suffering to hope, reminding all that care was holy. Children of poor remembered hospitals all their lives. A warm bed after cold road, a kind hand in fever, a bowl of broth when hungry. Such memories lingered, shaping faith in mercy. Hospitals taught community value of compassion. They reminded townsfolk that strength must serve weakness, wealth aid poverty, health care for sickness. They embodied love as command, not choice. Even in plague, hospitals did not close. They filled beyond capacity, nuns and monks dying beside patients. Their sacrifice stood as testament to faith, mercy unbroken even as death pressed hardest. Hospitals left mark not only in lives saved, but in hearts touched. They stood as beacon of mercy, proof that amid suffering love endured. And so medieval hospitals, whether grand or humble, served as houses of healing and hope. They offered not perfection but presence, not cure but care, not riches but mercy. They taught that charity itself is medicine, that to share bread and prayer is healing, that in giving to weakest, community is strengthened. Their legacy lives not only in stone ruins, but in idea that care for sick is holy duty. Thus, hospitals were more than buildings. They were embodiments of compassion, houses where love became flesh, where Christ was seen in faces of poor, and where healing flowed as much from kindness as from herb or knife.